I want to share with you a little bit about this new book that I've written called Enemies and Allies. We are at the one-year anniversary point of the launch of All Israel News and our sister site, All Arab News. And this new book, Enemies and Allies, is actually a project of these two websites. I have turned over the copyright to the book to Near East Media, which oversees All Israel News and All Arab News. All profits from the book go to running these websites. Why? Because the two websites are the way we are trying to cover on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis the events that are happening in Israel and throughout the broader Middle East and North Africa and the Arab Islamic world. Events are moving very, very quickly. Just in the last year, since we launched our operations, it's been amazing what has happened. We've seen 4 Arab-Israeli peace and normalization treaties be set into motion. We've seen a Gaza war with 4,500 rockets fired at Israel. We've seen the surrender of Afghanistan to the Taliban, and as best we can tell, as I'm recording this, the Taliban retaking over a country that for 20 years we had liberated and we're trying to help get up on its feet. It's a disaster unfolding in Afghanistan. We see Iran now enriching uranium way past the agreed upon limits from the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama and then Vice President Joe Biden established. The Iranian regime is now enriching uranium at 60% purity. That is getting dangerously close to the 90 to 95% purity, in which you're now creating bomb-grade, military-grade fuel that you can turn into a nuclear warhead. So you've got a situation where we've seen, of course, the collapse of the government in Lebanon. We see trauma all throughout Syria. And you've got some just fascinating and disturbing and encouraging cross-currents. The enemies of the United States, the enemies of Israel, the enemies of the Western, Arab, Israeli, American, European alliance are getting more and more dangerous. The Iranian regime could not be more dangerous. They've never been this dangerous since the beginning of the Islamic Republic in 1979. We're getting to a crisis point where there's real concern that Israeli leaders will feel that they're on their own. And if they're going to stop Iran from building an arsenal of nuclear weapons that could lead to a second Holocaust, that Israel's leaders are going to have to strike militarily at these Iranian sites on their own. Obviously, we pray that's not necessary, but that's where we're trending right now. As I wrote this book, as we release this book, that's where we're heading. Incredibly dangerous. And then, of course, the collapse, the withdrawal, the surrender, really, of Afghanistan by the United States, all U.S. forces being ordered to leave, which set into motion the departure of all NATO and other allied forces, and the Taliban taking over. This bodes very, very ill. America's allies are worried. They're worried. Will the United States stand with them against these rising and increasingly powerful and threatening enemies? So that's pretty dark. That's pretty sobering. At the same time, you've got some incredibly exciting trend lines, right? We've seen the United Arab Emirates sign a peace and normalization treaty with Israel, the first time in a quarter of a century that an Arab state has done that. Bahrain was next. Sudan followed. And then, of course, the Kingdom of Morocco. This is game-changing. And in the book, I detail both the rising Iranian threat and the changing attitudes in the Arab world that's leading to peace, that's leading to normalization. Now, I don't paint a rosy picture in the book. What I describe is these two diametrically opposed cross currents. And what's unique about this book, Enemies and Allies, is that it's not just an observation from a distance. I'm taking you inside the Oval Office. You're sitting down with the President of the United States as I discuss with him the Iranian threat and the prospects for peace, a game-changing peace in the Middle East. I'm taking you inside the highest echelons of the Israeli government. You're meeting the President of Israel as we discuss these issues, the good, the bad, the ugly, 90 minutes on the record. I take you inside a joint session of Congress that I attended as the Prime Minister of Israel lays out the case for why the Iran nuclear deal is so dangerous. And I sit down with the Prime Minister of Israel, and you hear in his own words why he believes that the Iranian regime is not just made up of radical Islamists willing to use force to achieve their objectives, political and religious objectives, but the Prime Minister of Israel believes these are apocalyptic Islamists, believing that they're bringing about the end of days, the end of civilization as we know it, and the beginnings of some sort of eschatological kingdom for Islam. These are direct conversations. You're hearing these leaders in their own voices. But what makes this book, Enemies and Allies, even more, if it can be more unique, anyway, certainly one of its kind, the first of its kind, is that I take you into palaces in Jordan, in Egypt, in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, as you meet firsthand and sit with, as I sit with, the leaders of these countries. As it happens, God opened the door for me to be the first Israeli citizen, aside from a Mossad chief or some other person at that level, but just as a normal, ordinary citizen of the state of Israel, and a follower of Jesus Christ at that, from a Jewish background, to sit with the leadership of Saudi Arabia. We were told by the Saudi foreign minister before our meeting with the Crown Prince, you're the first Christian delegation that's ever been invited to the palace in the 300 years since the Saud family took over most of the peninsula of Arabia. And we had hours and hours with these leaders sitting and asking them the most sensitive of questions. Why don't you have churches that are allowed to exist anywhere in Saudi Arabia? Will you make peace with Israel? How do you perceive the Iranian threat? Why did you, Your Royal Highness, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, why did you liken the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, to Adolf Hitler? How are you going to handle all the extremism in the textbooks that are being taught in Saudi schools, or the extremists that are preaching in Saudi mosques? And that's just, of course, one country. We had these type of conversations face to face, heart to heart, on the record, in country after country. And there's not a single book on the market that takes you into these rooms and lets you hear these leaders respond to these types of questions from a journalist, from an evangelical Christian, from anybody. These are not leaders that spend time, hours and hours on the record with people who are going to write a book. It's just not the way they do it. But for whatever reason, and you'll see it in Enemies and Allies, they sat down with me. As many of them invited me back multiple times to continue the conversation. And I am deeply honored to have this opportunity to put it in a book, to tell those stories. Why did we go? A lot of people thought we shouldn't have gone to these countries. Some of them, there were highly controversial moments. Not everyone will agree with my conclusions. I'm not asking you to love or hate any of the people I spoke to, but I want you to hear them in their own words. Are they the type of people that are changing the Middle East for good? All these Arab leaders that I met with are making the case that they are making sweeping changes, sweeping reforms in their countries that have never been made before. And they want people around the world, certainly in North America, certainly in the United States, to know that they're making these changes. They don't want to be perceived as bad guys. They don't want to be perceived as enemies, they see themselves as allies. They want to be seen as allies. They're not saying that everything they've done is right, and they know that there's a lot of change that still has to happen. But love them or hate them, agree with them or not, you're going to hear them in their own words, and you're going to be able to evaluate them and make your own decisions. This is exactly what we're trying to do on all Israel news, on all Arab news, on these websites. But day-to-day journalism is pointillism. Okay, you're painting the dots, as it were, of the day-to-day events. We're not only trying to report them, we're also trying to give them context. We're trying to provide analysis. What's happening? Why does it matter? Why should it matter to me? Why should it matter to you? That's day-to-day journalism. But what a book can do is zoom out, and you get to see the big picture. You get to see all the dots, but you get to see how they're, you get to see them in context. A book, a nonfiction book like Enemies and Allies, allows me to provide a larger canvas and allows you to see events and try to compare, good, bad, or ugly, what's happening and how it fits in to the rapidly changing events in the Middle East. And that's what, and I found it fascinating to write this book. And I'm hopeful that as you read it and discuss it with friends, with neighbors, Jews, Christians, Muslims, people of no faith, people of other faiths, that you will get a picture, an inside look at the most volatile, and I would argue the most consequential region in the world, in a book there's no other book like this. If there was, I wouldn't have written it. There's no reason to go write somebody else's book that's already been done. But I got a first hand and front row seat at history being made. It's history that's ongoing, and there could be lots of twists and turns. I'm sure there will be in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. But over the last few years, I've really had an opportunity to see something up close and personal. And not just me. I brought evangelical leaders from the United States on these delegations to sit with these leaders. They asked their own questions, and it wasn't just me. I wanted to open the aperture, and I wanted to allow a range of different evangelical leaders from different theological and political backgrounds, different races, both men and women, to come and sit with these leaders with me to ask their toughest questions, their most heartfelt questions, questions that never get to be asked by Christians of Arab Muslim leaders and Israeli leaders, and then to help me evaluate, what did we just see? What did we just hear? Do we believe these folks? Are they really making positive reforms, or is this all window dressing? Is this all PR? Is this all spin? I think that releasing Enemies and Allies at the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the horrific attacks of 9/11 that affected this city and, of course, New York and Pennsylvania so brutally, so painfully, so tragically, I think this is the right moment to take an assessment of what has happened over the last 20 years. Where are we in our fight with radical Islamism? What's going well? What's not working well? And how has the region changed? And it has changed. And I think that one other note I'll make is that I think for the last 18 months or so, as Americans have been dealing with COVID, as the world has been dealing with COVID, we have, of course, looked inward. We've been dealing with a horrific virus that has, we haven't really seen a pandemic like this since the Spanish flu 100 years ago. So we've been dealing with the health effects of this, the controversy over the vaccines, get them, don't get them. We've been dealing with the economic effects of closures, of shutdowns. We've been dealing with the explosion of race riots, the closure of churches, an incredibly divisive political campaign in 2020. There's been a lot of reasons that Americans, Canadians, others have been inwardly focused, not looking at Israel, not looking at the Arab and Muslim world. But in that time, there's been a lot of changes. And as the world sort of looks up and sort of catches our breath and tries to examine again what's happening in the Middle East, Enemies and Allies becomes the first book, the only book that sort of takes you into this world and lets you catch up on a lot of the dramatic changes that have been happening so far. So I hope you find it helpful. We'll be continuing to cover, we'll provide excerpts at All Israel News and All Arab News, and we'll link to stories that are done about the book. But I hope you'll buy a copy. It's available in hardcover, ebook formats, and audio. If you don't even want to read it, just download it on your phone and let someone read it to you. It's not me. It's a professional. But I hope it's helpful. And I hope it becomes a point of discussion. And for those of you who are Christians, Messianic Jews, others, I hope this is something that will help you pray with more focus. You'll be more informed about what's happening. And I raise a lot of questions. This is not a book with just answers. This book raises a lot of questions based on the changes that are ongoing. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you find the book interesting, and I hope you will post your reviews at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and our Facebook page, and you can tweet at me. Even if you hate the book, that's fine. I want to hear from you. Again, Joel Rosenberg, author of Enemies and Allies, from Washington, D.C., just across the street from the White House today, hoping you'll find Enemies and Allies fascinating and some of it encouraging, though I know some of it will be very, very disturbing as we look at the rise of some very, very dangerous enemies. God bless you. It's great to be with you.